Daniel Carter had lived in his family's home for over 3 decades, cherishing every inch of the property that had been passed down through generations. At the center of his yard stood a majestic 150-year-old oak tree, a towering monument of history planted by his great-great-grandfather when the house was first built. It wasn't just a tree to him. It was a living piece of his family's legacy, a symbol of endurance, and a reminder of the generations that came before him. Every summer, he would sit beneath its sprawling branches, sipping iced tea and listening to the gentle rustling of its leaves. Birds nested in its limbs. Children played in its shade, and over the years, it had become a cornerstone of the neighborhood's character. But one fateful morning, Daniel awoke to the sound of chainsaws roaring outside his window. Disoriented and confused, he rushed to his front yard, only to be met with a horrifying sight. His beloved oak tree was being cut down. A team of workers, clad in neon vests, had already severed several massive branches, their limbs lying lifeless on the ground like fallen soldiers. Panic surged through him as he yelled for them to stop, but his voice was drowned out by the mechanical shrieks of the saws. He stormed toward the workers, demanding to know who authorized his destruction, and one of them, barely glancing up from his task, simply said, "HOA orders." His stomach twisted in rage. He had never been informed, never given a notice, nothing. He pushed through the gathering crowd of curious neighbors, his heart pounding, and marched straight to Linda Prescott's house. Linda, the HOA President, was a woman notorious for her iron grip on the community. She claimed to have a neighborhood's best interests at heart, but everyone knew she ruled with an iron fist, issuing fines for minor infractions and enforcing policies that seemed more about control than upkeep. When she answered the door, she was dressed impeccably in her usual blazer and pearls, a smug smirk playing on her lips. "Ah, Daniel," she said, as if she had been expecting him. "I assume this is about the tree?" His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You had no right to cut down my tree," he shouted, his voice shaking with emotion. She sighed dramatically, crossing her arms. It was an eyesore, Daniel, blocking the view of the lake from the other homes. Several residents complained, and as HOA president, I made an executive decision. Daniel could hardly believe what he was hearing. An executive decision? That tree was on my property. It's been here for over a century. You had no legal authority to do this. But Linda simply waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, come now. The community's aesthetics take precedence over personal attachment. It's for the greater good." He wanted to scream. He wanted to shake her, to make her understand the gravity of what she had done. But he knew it would be futile. Instead, he turned on his heel, glaring at her one last time. "You're going to regret this, Linda. I swear it." She laughed lightly, shutting the door in his face. But as Daniel walked away, the smirk on her lips faltered for just a moment, because she had no idea just how far he was willing to go to make her pay. Daniel Carter spent the rest of the day staring at the gaping hole where his beloved oak tree had once stood. The scent of fresh cut wood lingered in the air, an agonizing reminder of what had been stolen from him. He ran his fingers through the sawdust that coated the grass, his mind racing with a mix of grief and rage. How could Linda Prescott, the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood's aesthetics, believe she had the right to destroy something so deeply personal, so irreplaceable? He knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. That evening, he sat down at his desk, pulling out every document he had on the Homeowners Association. He had never paid much attention to their bylaws before, always considering the HOA a minor nuisance rather than a genuine threat. But now, as he flipped through the dense legal jargon, he searched for anything, any loophole, any rule, that could prove Linda had overstepped her authority. After hours of reading, he found it. The HOA had strict guidelines on tree removals, and while they did have the power to request removals for safety concerns, they were required to provide written notice and hold a community vote for any non-emergency decisions involving private property. Linda had done neither. The realization filled him with renewed determination. He wasn't just going to fight her for his tree. He was going to expose her for the power-hungry tyrant she was. The next day, he reached out to Sarah Mitchell, an old college friend and a sharp attorney specializing in homeowner rights. She listened patiently as he recounted the entire ordeal, her expression growing darker by the minute. Linda Prescott has been running this HOA like her own personal fiefdom for years, Sarah said, tapping her pen against her notepad. You're not the first person she's wronged, Daniel, but you might be the first person who can actually take her down. That was all Daniel needed to hear. Together, they began investigating the HOA's financial records. Sarah, using her legal connections, managed to obtain years' worth of financial reports, and what they found was staggering. Linda had been embezzling HOA funds for years, disguising personal expenses as neighborhood improvements. Tens of thousands of dollars had been funneled into vague projects, many of which had no receipts or legitimate paper trails. There were reports of excessive fees imposed on homeowners for minor violations, with no record of where the collected money had gone. Even worse, it seemed that Linda had been selectively enforcing HOA rules, targeting homeowners she disliked while allowing her close friends to skirt violations entirely. Daniel's anger deepened as he realized the extent of Linda's corruption. This wasn't just about his tree anymore. This was about justice for every homeowner who had been bullied, extorted, and silenced under her reign. Armed with this information, Daniel began reaching out to his neighbors, sharing what he had uncovered. At first, many were hesitant to speak out, afraid of retaliation. But as word spread and more homeowners came forward with their own grievances, the tide began to turn. Stories emerged of unfair fines, threats of foreclosure over minor infractions, and other instances where Linda had used her position to intimidate and manipulate. One elderly couple revealed that they had been forced to pay thousands in unnecessary landscaping fees after Linda deemed their front yard unsightly, despite it being well maintained. Another resident admitted she had been fined repeatedly for having a garden gnome on her porch, something Linda's own friends had on their properties without issue. The community was finally waking up. Linda, of course, caught wind of Daniel's efforts and wasted no time retaliating. He started receiving anonymous threats in the mail, warning him to drop it before it's too late. His trash cans were mysteriously overturned in the middle of the night. Someone even lodged a false noise complaint against him, resulting in a formal warning from the HOA. But none of it deterred him. If anything, it only proved how desperate Linda was to keep him quiet. As tensions escalated, Daniel and Sarah decided it was time to take legal action. With the overwhelming evidence they had gathered, they filed a lawsuit against Linda and the HOA for illegal tree removal, financial fraud, and abuse of power. It didn't take long for the media to catch wind of the case. Local news outlets picked up the story, interviewing Daniel in front of his barren yard, his voice filled with emotion as he spoke about his family's legacy being destroyed. This isn't just about a tree, he told the reporters. It's about standing up to corruption. It's about making sure no one else in this neighborhood is taken advantage of ever again. The community rallied behind him. Residents who had once been too afraid to speak out now openly criticized Linda's leadership, demanding her removal from office. Petitions were signed. Meetings were held. And then the final blow came, an anonymous tip to the local authorities exposing Linda's financial misconduct. 2 weeks later, the HOA office was raided. Investigators seized records, computers, and files, and Linda Prescott was escorted from her home in handcuffs. The once untouchable HOA president was now facing serious legal charges, and the entire neighborhood watched as a reign of terror crumbled before their eyes. But Daniel knew the fight wasn't over yet. There was still justice to be served, and he wasn't going to stop until Linda was held fully accountable for every single thing she had done. The neighborhood was buzzing with anticipation. For years, Linda Prescott had ruled over the HOA with an iron fist, imposing fines, issuing threats, and bending the rules to suit her own interests. But now, for the first time, the power she had wielded so recklessly was slipping through her fingers. The moment she was arrested, the residents of Oak Ridge Estates felt a collective weight lift off their shoulders. Still, Daniel Carter knew that while Linda's arrest was a significant victory, it was only the beginning. The legal battle against her and the HOA was about to begin, and Daniel was determined to see it through to the end. Linda had always believed herself untouchable. She had spent years manipulating people into submission, using fear and bureaucracy to keep her authority intact. But the overwhelming evidence Daniel and Sarah had gathered was impossible to ignore. Embezzlement, fraud, illegal fines, Each charge stacked higher against her, and with the media shining a spotlight on the case, there was no escaping accountability this time. As the court proceedings began, Daniel sat with Sarah in the front row, watching as Linda stood before the judge. She no longer carried the smug confidence she once had, nor did she wear the expensive pearl necklaces that had once signified her self-importance. Instead, she looked small, frail, and furious. She had pleaded not guilty, of course, maintaining that everything she had done was in the best interest of the community. But the evidence painted a far different picture. The prosecution laid everything bare. They presented bank statements showing thousands of HOA dollars funneled into Linda's personal accounts. There were falsified invoices for maintenance work that had never been completed, excessive fines imposed on select residents, while her own friends and allies had their infractions overlooked. Witnesses came forward. Former HOA board members who admitted they had been bullied into silence, neighbors who had been strong-armed into compliance, even local contractors who revealed that Linda had demanded special payments in exchange for giving them business. Then came Daniel's testimony. He took the stand, clearing his throat as he addressed the courtroom. "This isn't just about a tree," he began, his voice steady despite the raw anger burning in his chest. "This is about years of corruption, about a woman who believed she was above the law. My family's oak tree stood for 150 years. It was a symbol of our history, our roots in this community, and she had it destroyed for nothing more than a better view. If she was willing to go that far, imagine what else she's done." He detailed his experience, from the moment he heard the chainsaws to the threats he received when he tried to fight back. He spoke of the countless homeowners who had been taken advantage of, the elderly couple who had been forced to pay thousands in unnecessary fees, the people who had lost their homes over fraudulent fines. By the time he finished, the courtroom was silent. Even the judge looked disgusted. Linda, meanwhile, refused to look at him. The trial lasted for weeks, but the outcome was clear long before the final verdict was read. The evidence was too overwhelming to ignore, and the jury deliberated for only a few hours before reaching a decision. Guilty. Linda Prescott was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to every resident she had wronged. The HOA, under court order, was forced to undergo a complete restructuring. A new board was elected, one that was transparent, fair, and accountable to the people. The days of unchecked power were over. But for Daniel, there was still one last matter to settle. Linda's illegal decision to cut down his 150-year-old oak tree had not been forgotten. With the HOA's corruption exposed, he was able to take legal action for the damages done to his property. The judge ruled in his favor, awarding him a substantial financial settlement, not only for the tree, but for the emotional distress and damage to his land. And while no amount of money could truly replace what had been lost, Daniel knew exactly what he wanted to do with it. With the help of the community, he purchased and planted a new oak sapling in the same spot where his great-great-grandfather's tree had once stood. It would take years to grow into the giant that had once graced his yard. But Daniel wasn't just thinking about the present. He was thinking about the future, about the generations who would live in this house after him, about the legacy that Linda had tried to erase, but had ultimately failed to destroy. The day the tree was planted, the entire neighborhood gathered in his yard to celebrate. It wasn't just about the tree. It was about what it represented: a fresh start, justice, the triumph of a community over corruption. As Daniel looked around, seeing his neighbors laughing, talking, and embracing, he realized something important. Linda had tried to divide them, but in the end, she had only brought them closer together. And as the sun set over Oak Ridge Estates, casting a warm golden light over the tiny new sapling, Daniel smiled, knowing that some roots, no matter what, could never truly be cut down.